Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. Today is the first in our webinar series on mandatory reporting. My name is Morgan, and I'm a community research liaison with the University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities at the Oregon Health and Science University. The Oregon Health and Science University sits on the occupied land of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Wotlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, Wasco, and many indigenous nations of the Willamette Valley and Columbia River Plateau. Before we introduce our presenters today, let's go over a few details about the webinar. American Sign Language interpretation is available for today's webinar. Thank you, Jackie and Donna, for being here today. Spanish language interpretation is also available. Thank you, Rosie and Andre, for being here today. If you click the icon that looks like a globe, you can choose to listen to this webinar in Spanish. And then I think Rosie is also going to drop something in the chat for you about how to select Spanish language interpretation. You can also turn on closed captioning by clicking the CC icon. And if you have a question for any of our presenters, you can type it in the Q&A box. And now I'll turn it over to our presenters.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us today. My name is Kate Hildebrandt. I use she, her pronouns. And today we are going to be talking about reporting of sexual violence and abuse in Oregon educational contexts. We'll start off with a little more grounding, and then we'll share with you what we're going to be talking about today. This webinar or this section is designed to give you some kind of foundational information that you can use and that we'll build on throughout the next two webinars. So the first thing we want to do is give a disclaimer that this information in this webinar is not offered as, intended as, and does not constitute legal advice. It is provided for informational purposes only, and none of the information provided should be considered a substitute for professional legal advice. Additionally, state and federal laws are updated regularly, and changes to that law may impact the information shared in this webinar, especially if you're watching it as a recording. So to tell you a little bit more about ourselves, again, my name is Kate Hildebrandt. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a civil rights and Title IX specialist at the Oregon Department of Education. So my role is to provide training and technical assistance to Oregon's public schools, public K through 12 schools, and public charter schools around the state in understanding and implementing state and federal civil rights law. And I'm going to turn over to my co-presenter, Eli, to introduce himself.
Hey, thank you so much, Kate. Hello, all. My name is Eli Cox. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Abuse Prevention Coordinator at the Oregon Sexual Assault Task Force. At the task force, I facilitate the Bridge Project, which seeks to further connect abuse and violence prevention efforts across the lifespan in Oregon through collaboration, coordination, and cross-sector support. In the past, I've worked in schools, delivering healthy relationships education. I've worked at child advocacy centers, domestic violence agencies, and just am really excited to be here today. And I will note that I don't exactly look like that mouse that's next to my picture, but I'm striving for that. That is Mega Mouse, and she's my little superhero mouse. So thanks for letting us bring some animal energy in here. So as Kate mentioned, a lot of today's webinar will be foundation setting. We know in this series, there are some really amazing webinars, conversations, and topics upcoming. So today we want to settle in with three main spaces, mainly thinking about your role as a mandatory reporter and what that can look like, some of those responsibilities that entails, Title IX and Title IX reports. And then finally, we want to spend some time thinking about our collaborative trauma-informed responses. When we recognize that, especially when people experience violence, harm, and abuse, that oftentimes they feel like their control, their power, their agency can be taken away. And so what we really want to think about are what are those processes that we can do and build in, whether in our classroom settings, any educational context, that help to restore people's choice, agency, and autonomy, and really them being the narrator of their story as much as possible in their lives. Next slide, please. So we want to take a moment to settle in on further with today's goals, and starting off with what we will do, just to set some real clear expectations and foundations around this space, because we know there's so much to this content and topic, and so we'll do our best to cover what we can in this hour and a half, and recognizing there will still be a lot more to dig into. So what we will do is examine mandatory reporter and Title IX roles and responsibilities. We are also going, again, to set groundwork and foundation for what's to come in the following webinars. And we want to explore that best practices and resources, including confidential advocates, which we'll talk about a little bit more coming up, that seek to promote trauma-informed response and increase survivor agency. It's really important. I want to take a second to note here too, that in this webinar, as we're talking about different ways to respond and support survivors, we are not advocating for confidential advocacy or mandatory reporting over one or the other. We're really focused on supporting that partnership between the two, especially, and again, thinking about then also with Title IX and how that relates. But Oregon relies heavily on mandatory reporting model to respond to child abuse. And this can be a meaningful tool to help some, and in other cases, it may cause additional harms and or increased abuse. So knowing that limiting choice and voice in our processes can re-traumatize, it can be meaningful to offer people confidential resources to disclose and learn about all of their options, what they can expect, and how to promote safety to be best prepared to mitigate harm and re-traumatization when going through certain systems. And of course, also want to note that individual experiences are going to largely vary, and we're always striving for better systems and responses. But when we recognize that the more options we can give people to support them, this increases the opportunities that they're going to have better outcomes and experiences going forward because they have gotten to have more choice control and be in the driver's seat, so to speak. So that's a little info on what we are planning to cover. And then what we won't do today is being really transparent at the beginning. We will not pretend to be experts in serving individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We want to recognize that while we've worked to support individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in our roles in the past, at the same time, we are not in this space each and every day. And we know that so many of you listening into this call and here at the USAID program, you are really the experts. You have the best practices and know exactly what communities are needing or wanting. We can, however, offer some broad support of what we've seen in terms of mandatory reporting, Title IX, and also confidential advocacy. So we'll try and help support that as best as possible, and knowing that there's a lot more nuance to this conversation to continue. We also will not provide a deep dive into mandatory reporting and confidential advocacy laws. Otherwise, we could be here for 5 hours. And knowing that there will be further information coming up along the way in the following webinar here too. But we really just, again, want to set that foundation. And then also want to note that we are not legally able to determine what is reportable. So we will have time, hopefully, for question and answers throughout. Please drop them in that question and answer box as they may come up to you, for folks that are in here on the webinar currently. But we do want to note that within that time that we do have, we won't be able to determine whether or not something you've experienced or that maybe that happened in a classroom is reportable or isn't. And that's just because that's determined through Oregon Revised Statute. Oh gosh, sorry. I said I wasn't going to name all the laws, but that's law 419B.005. We will have resources and spaces to refer back to Oregon DHS as they really set the parameters for what is reportable. But we can guide and try and support and help how we respond to that. But again, we're not legally able to determine what is a report or what is not. All right, next slide, please.
All right, we also wanted to give a content note about this webinar. So we are going to discuss reporting and confidential options, which also includes a discussion of sexual violence and abuse. We may share scenarios and examples, and in those, explicit and offensive language is occasionally used. All the examples shared are solely for educational purposes and are designed to contain elements of situations you may respond to in your role working with young people. Please take care of yourself during this webinar. If something is hitting a little too close to home or feeling overwhelming, please feel free to take a step back, take care of yourself. If you need to step out for a few minutes or fast forward the recording, usually if you come back in 5 or 10 minutes, we will have moved through that example and on to the next topic. But I also just want to note that everything that we're talking about today is a little bit of a heavy topic. So again, please take care of yourself as needed as you're engaging with this content.
We also wanted to add a quick note on some of the language that we're going to be using today. So you will hear us refer to both survivor and victim at different times. We interchangeably are going to use those words, victim and survivor, to describe someone who has experienced violence and abuse, depending upon the context. As most legal frameworks utilize the language of victim, this is the predominant term utilized when referencing laws and policies. Survivor is often used to signify the strength and resiliency of people who have experienced violence. And I'll also note that many people who are also consider themselves victims will also say that those same strengths apply to them as well, and that resiliency. It's just important to note that people prefer different terms to describe their own experiences. So you will hear us use each of those at different times today. You'll hear us use youth versus child. While we will use the word child at times in relation to mandatory reporting of child abuse, for example, we will often use the word youth instead. Generally, what we experience in society and just in terms of further forms of oppression and ageism, the word child is often used as a way by people to demean or take away credibility, agency, and autonomy from young people. And we find that youth helps highlight that power and that full humanity of young people still too, in recognizing their strengths and their truth. And especially for anyone that is working with teenagers, like that gets old really quick when a teen or someone feels like they're being referred to as a child or a kid, right? So we want to use young people, youth as often as possible. And then finally, confidential advocacy. So while there's many ways that we may use the word confidential in everyday conversations with people or even youth that we are serving, in terms of like, if it's something personal they're going through in their life that doesn't relate to violence and abuse, that, they just say, this is confidential. I'm just letting you know kind of where I'm at on something. That's, way understood there. But in this case, when we're talking about confidential advocacy, we are really wanting to highlight and describe services, communications that are used by advocates that are people from qualified victim survivor services organizations who provide completely confidential advocacy services under the Violence Against Women's Act. And in this way, anyways, we'll talk a lot more about that later on and dig in further. But that's what we're thinking about when we're talking about confidential advocacy, specific people who have a lot of training and also fall under a role. Perfect with that transition there. Want to also set one last foundational piece here. So on the graphic that's in front of us here, and I'll describe it out here too, we have an arrow at the bottom of the screen that goes both directions. And on the left-hand side, it starts with the number 0, and on the right-hand side, it goes to 60 plus. So that's to determine ages. So at the left side is young people, ages 0 or at birth. And then across the arrow moving to the right of the screen is 60 plus seniors. and just recognizing this lifespan effect, imagining a person starting at 0 and working their way all the way across to the right side there at the end of their life as they're in their older years. Also on the screen, we have different forms of violence in different colored boxes. So at the top, we have gang violence, and this falls in the age range. Usually people experience this, and I should say not always, but this is a generalized kind of graphic here. So we have gang violence and people experiencing that generally from teenage years up into their middle of their life. We have commercial sexual exploitation of children as another box, as well as trafficking, human trafficking, and that's something, a form of violence that can be experienced across a person's lifespan from birth to the end of their life. We have domestic violence as well as something that is in orange, and that's across a person's lifespan that can be experienced, whether from young age or to older ages. We have sexual assault starting in the teen years across the lifespan to someone's older ages. Dating violence, we have that also again, teen years, middle school years, moving throughout the life. People can experience dating violence as adults, as youth. And then we also have peer-to-peer interpersonal violence, this one being more on the elementary school range, generally when people can start to experience that from their peers, again, moving through and across the lifespan. And then at the very bottom, we have a form of violence for child abuse and neglect. We have that set around age 0 to birth to young 20s. And then to the far right, we have elder abuse and people experiencing that from age 60 and up. And what we want to recognize with this graph and these different forms of violence is the truth that we often recognize people may be experiencing multiple forms of violence at the same time. Already, one form of violence can be incredibly complex, really difficult to navigate and complicated, but also when we're thinking about there's so many layers to other spaces in their lives where they may be experiencing harm. It's important just to keep this context in mind, as well as the aspect that these forms of violence have the same root causes. So today, when we're talking about, or specifically sexual violence and mandatory reports in that direction, we want to think about how it's also related and shares root causes and factors with other forms of violence as well, too. And with that, one thing that we also find then is also protective factors, and recognizing that, and really want to return this to anyone here who's doing education with youth, young people, especially recognizing, you said the program of the Friendships and Dating program is amazing work and amazing prevention work that goes a long ways in preventing not just like unhealthy relationships or potential like sexual violence, but also can work to prevent so many other forms of violence across a person's lifespan. So we just really want to thank you all for the role that you play in helping our communities to be healthier, for people to have access to their rights, and any work that is working with people with disabilities to help them be in control of their life and their stories and their rights is prevention work. And just thank you so much for all that you're doing to help shift our world so that we no longer have communities where violence is experienced at any point in someone's lifespan. So thank you all very much for everything that you contribute into. All right, next slide, please. So now we want to come to this first section here with some of that foundation of understanding your role as a mandatory reporter of child abuse. And I'll say here, just to give that definition, when someone who is designated a mandatory reporter of child abuse suspects or knows that a child might be a victim of abuse, they are legally obligated to inform the Oregon Child Abuse Hotline or the police as soon as possible. So I want to give that definition, and we'll come back to that again, but just that's what a mandatory reporter is as well too, for anyone that's tuned in. So we'll start with a little bit of history here, and we'll read everything that is on the screen as we go through this presentation as well too. So just want to name that. In 1963, Oregon passed its first mandatory reporting law requiring healthcare professionals and police officers to report the physical abuse of children aged 12 or younger. So prior to that, that did not exist in Oregon, and it was a very fledgling across the nation as well too. And we know, again, just through so many norms and changes of people oftentimes thinking that of youth as property and as not full people, and so like violence and abuse against them was just that's how you raise someone, right? Or that it's like they weren't entitled to the same protections. So that initially started in 1963 to try and address some of that. That's where that intention came from. And then over the years, amendments and changes to Oregon's laws added additional people to the list of who is a mandatory reporter and expanded the age range from 18. Oh, expanded the age range to the age of 18. So it took it from above 12 all the way up to 18 there. And as well, 21 for people receiving services at a child caring agency. And then in 2013, Oregon greatly expanded who was a mandatory reporter under Oregon's law and additionally established an exception for community-based nonprofit organizations whose primary purpose is to provide confidential direct services to victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking. So again, in the resources that we will connect you to at the end of this presentation, one is through Oregon DHS, and it has that full list of everyone that is considered a mandatory reporter. And also, as we get a little bit further along, we'll talk more about confidential advocates. And essentially, boiling it down really quick here, one of the reasons it was determined to make exceptions for advocates in terms of being mandatory reporters was to help support people when they were experiencing domestic violence. And oftentimes the person causing that harm was using the children as a way to try and make it appear that the person they were hurting was complicit in that violence also. So potentially saying, well, if you tell anyone what's happening to you, I'm going to tell them that you were hitting the kids or that you were also part of this, and then you're going to lose the kids too. So, and that's just a very quick explanation there, but recognizing that in terms of to best support survivors of violence, oftentimes they needed to be in full possession of their control of their story, going through it, and to really try and protect from potential perpetrators, people that were doing violence, from manipulating them throughout the process. Next slide, please. So I think, what is mandatory reporting? So mandatory reporters of child abuse are required to report the following, although this is not a comprehensive list: physical abuse, sexual abuse and exploitation, neglect, threat of harm, and mental injury. There are also additional definitions of abuse that require mandatory reports when children are in care, as defined under ORS 418.275. In addition to mandatory reporting of child abuse, many people are also mandatory reporters of abuse towards aging adults and people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. There had been that recognition in terms of disparities and numbers of people experiencing violence and abuse that often wasn't reported, was coming from those same root causes and oppressive factors. Again, we recognize of people using ableism to try and make someone more vulnerable and then less likely to be believed potentially. So that was one of the reasons that they tried to include that for being a mandatory report. Under OAR 411.054.0020 and as defined under ORS 124.050 to 124.095, these mandatory reporters must report suspected non-accidental physical injury, neglect, abandonment, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, financial exploitation, involuntary seclusion, any wrongful use of a physical or chemical restraint, and self-neglect. These reports are made to law enforcement or Oregon Department of Human Services Adult Protective Services. And I will note too, oh, sorry, Kate, I paused there. If you could go back just one more second. Thanks. That this often requirement for people that are mandatory reporters, often this requirement may extend beyond the role of an employee or someone's personal, into someone's personal life. Sometimes this is referred to as the 24/7, 365 rule. So any day, any hour, any week, any day of the year. And this, of course, will depend on organization or school employees' role, school policy, and the relationship between people experiencing violence. So thanks for that, Kate. And next slide, please. So again, we know we're going to be highlighting in this webinar sexual abuse, exploitation, but we want to go through each of these 5 main forms of what generally is reported here in Oregon. So physical abuse, any assault or physical injury to a child which has been caused by other than accidental means. Sexual abuse and exploitation, subjecting another person to sexual contact without consent, being so rape, sodomy, unlawful sexual penetration, and incest, contributing to the sexual delinquency of a minor, allowing, permitting, encouraging, or hiring a child to engage in prostitution as well. All right. Neglect. And, sorry, Kate. I was just giving a moment for Jackie to switch over. And then I just want to name off to neglect, including but not limited to the failure to provide adequate food, clothing, shelter, or medical care that is likely to endanger the health or welfare of the child, the unlawful exposure of child to a controlled substance, threat of harm, subjecting a child to substantial risk of harm to a child's health and welfare, and mental injury, observable and substantial impairment of child's mental, physiological ability to function caused by cruelty with due regard to the culture of the child. Okay, next slide, please. So when someone is a designated mandatory reporter of child abuse, suspects or knows that a child might be a victim of abuse, they are legally obligated to inform the Oregon Child Abuse Hotline or the police as soon as possible. It's important to note here too, just kind of in that last slide mentioned about culture, one thing that has been recognized, again, is the intention of this mandatory reporting policy and system is to try and stop violence from happening. But one thing that was recognized has been, again, the harm and the over-reporting oftentimes of communities of color in comparison to white communities or white people. And this has been something that Oregon DHS has been working on a lot. So when you check out their updated video, they have a full section of this video really more supported around a bias that someone may be experiencing when they're making a report, and just different ways to work through and think through how our bias impacts what we define or may feel is child abuse as well. So I just want to note that important distinction as we look again for a community of colors being largely and way more impacted in terms of not just actual violence and abuse, but just over reporting and sometimes also false reports as a result of people associating bias with that. Generally in reports, it must include, and again, if this information is known, sometimes in the past, I think as mandatory reporters, there's a lot of training and pressure put on people that we have to have all of the answers right at the moment someone makes a call and reports violence and abuse. And again, we just do the best that you can with the information you have. So generally, reports must include, if you know it, the name, date of birth, age for all adults or children involved, description of abuse and the impact to child's health and safety, the alleged perpetrator's name, relationship, location, and access, cultural or language considerations and ethnicities, any known American, Indian, or Alaska Native heritage, which we'll talk about on the next slide here, and then contact information for those involved. And again, oftentimes we will not have all of this information. For the many times I've made a report, generally everyone that I've worked with at the hotline has been really understanding of what I do have and what I don't have. And it's just, that's also when we get into kind of the do's and don'ts of reporting. I'm not here to be the detective to investigate and have to pull all these other pieces out of youth that can be re-traumatizing as well too. So just recognizing the role that we don't have to have all the answers, but these may be some of the things that people ask for. Next slide, please. And so what this ends up looking like is this visual and graphic here. So we've got Oregon Child Abuse Hotline and law enforcement. Those are the initial places that when a mandatory reporter suspects form of violence and abuse, they will call into these spaces. Important to note, if you feel someone is in imminent danger, generally ODHS recommends calling 911 right away. But otherwise, each of these systems, child abuse hotline through ODHS and law enforcement, will cross-report to each other. So regardless of who you call first, they will be communicating. And then to the right there is a arrow that also, again, that previous slide had about like knowledge of if whether anyone in the family or the youth maybe ain't Indigenous, Native American, Alaska Native, because they have the right, and especially any tribal and Indian child welfare departments get to connect and to work to support members of their tribe. And so if that is part of this situation, then Oregon Child Abuse Hotline and law enforcement also be connecting and working with tribal and Indian child welfare. After that initial report is made, there'll be a screening by ODHS and Oregon Department of Human Services, and an initial investigation by law enforcement, or if it rises to that level. And if it is founded, then, and there may sometimes be the option that it goes as a criminal case and it goes to trial. Oftentimes, I don't have the exact number at the moment, but I do want to name that the amount of times that a case actually ends up going to trial is actually pretty small in relation to the amount of reports that ODHS receives on a regular basis, but it does happen from time to time. But that would be the general way it tracks. And through those initial screening by DHS and investigation by law enforcement, collaboration with other community partners may include Child Advocacy Center, and there's a space for forensic interviewing, child abuse medical assessments, and other family supports, essentially for youth and families to go through this process of being interviewed to find out more knowledge in a really trauma-informed setting that or tries to be as trauma-informed as possible with what's going on, connect to resources, and under one roof there. So youth is not having to retell their story over and over again. This could also include court-appointed special advocates, also known as CASAs, who provide court accompaniment and legal advocacy in the case it does go to trial, and then relief nurseries who provide parent education and home visiting, and oftentimes do some amazing prevention work too. What we recognize and what there's a lot of shifts and working towards in Oregon and other states is how do we get families and communities more connected to resources. Oftentimes, people like anyone else want to do the best they can for their kids and their community. And what it looks like is just often people need connection to further resources and what do they need when we recognize that a lot of disparities that exist in our communities. As well, emergency rooms may play a role to provide acute, so in the moment, medical care, and at times a pediatric sexual assault nurse examination when available. Say, if a family shows up to an emergency room at 12 o'clock, the Child Advocacy Center may not be open then, or they may not have a relationship to have that youth be seen there in the middle of the night. So that's when emergency rooms may come into play. Next slide, please. And as we go to this next slide, I am noticing for myself, sometimes going through the systems and mandatory reporting, it can be really difficult as a mandatory reporter because I kind of, to a degree, there's a loss of control on our own end too, and the recognition that so much happens within systems that it can be really confusing. Of course, our main role generally when we come in, work we do to work with youth is to work and serve and support those individuals. We want to see the best for them in their lives. And oftentimes being a mandatory reporter isn't one of the initial things that we're thinking about when we get into it, especially when we recognize that trust and the relationships that we build up, that that isn't the route that a lot of youth want to go in terms of having a report made. So it is, I mean, not to put what we feel over what they're feeling. I mean, but they're feeling the worst in terms of like, this isn't maybe what I want to have happening right now. And so I want to take just kind of a moment to recognize that kind of like, I'm taking a deeper breath here because I can feel kind of worked up sometimes, um, especially when you see systems or some of our practices that were designed with maybe the best intention, that ends up being something that can be traumatizing too for youth and their experiences. So we want to think about what are some things that we can control. And even from the very beginning, especially when we know our roles as mandatory reporters, one of the aspects that we can do is to make sure that the youth and the students that we serve understand that we are mandatory reporters and what that entails. I know within the USED education sessions is the first couple classes where it's getting introduced to the content, what's going to be happening, and it can be a really great time. And maybe you all are already doing this too, to have the conversation around, hey, I'm a mandatory reporter. These are my roles. And this is what that means in terms of like, I want to make sure everyone is safe. And sometimes I may have to report something if I'm worried about someone's safety, health, and wellness. And of course, right, that could be workshopped. And that next dot point there about really normalizing, practicing, and developing language with your colleagues to share this information. And how do you all want to share that, knowing that each youth we work with is different? And so this can look like a lot of different ways. And especially, again, noticing some of the limitations. I've been learning more about the augmentative and alternative communication programs. Like there's oftentimes not a lot of language built in to be able to support some of these conversations. So other ways that we can advocate for that. But when we can really build in this space and not building in a conversation that has to be scary, like don't say anything around me. I'm a mandatory reporter, right? Like that's not what we're going for. We want to be able to just make sure that people at the same time have rights to know exactly what our roles are so that there isn't this extra shock or surprise when someone may disclose violence or abuse, either intentionally or accidentally. That can be something that's extra traumatizing. Because then we can also share what their other rights to confidentiality may be as well and other resources. So it can really be a time to empower people and youth that we work with around their rights, their agency, their autonomy, and make sure that we're modeling then transparency within our roles and responsibilities too. And like all things, this is a continuing conversation and can be a check-in, right? We don't have to spend half an hour each session on this, but it can be something that whether someone wasn't in class that day, whether someone forgot, I mean, it's just kind of the way that we all work. We just need those little reminders. And so there can be lots of times to build in, whether that's a reminder to a resource, that just our roles and responsibilities as well too, as well as options and resources in communities. Next slide, please, Kate. And then, so one thing in terms of being trauma-informed mandatory reporting, and we can really, if there is or does end up being a report, making sure that we're creating privacy and safety for that individual in the moment. Already, it can be a stressful situation for them. And so wanting to find and make sure we have that strategy within the space that we are working or where you're at for that privacy, safety, and a setting that can try and just not be out in the open for everyone to see. Because we want to really make sure that we're also presenting calm and reassuring. Even this can be really challenging and difficult. And again, we're never going to do anything perfectly. There is going to be times where like, I wish I had that one back, especially when we care so much about the people that we are working with. But oftentimes, sometimes if someone may see like shock or sadness or initial like pain, I don't want to put those down. Those are real feelings to us and are really valid. But it also may be able, or maybe something that then makes someone feel that sharing is harmful, or that they then are worried about how it's going to impact you. And so sometimes when we can just be present, like we always do in spaces, reassuring, and be with them in the moment. And we may have to hold things for a little while to be able to get to a space afterwards when we can really decompress and let all of that out. We want to give the person disclosing lots of positive feedback throughout. Just remember that we're letting them know this is not your fault what happened to you. Thank you so much for sharing and just finding these places to really uplift positively. Because again, so often people are told that if they tell, no one's going to believe them, or that they're isolated from information that they haven't even realized that what they're experiencing is abuse. So it can kind of come as a shock in that moment too. So being as positive we can with feedback, and again, avoiding asking about details of the event. Job to investigate, to dig in further. That potentially can be re-traumatizing. You make a report, professionals later on who are trained in how to interview in a way that is supportive and less traumatizing. They will do any further asking of questions. And of course, we can ask an open-ended as is needed sometimes, but just want to keep that in mind. We can ask the person about adult support that they have in their lives. Who else, as again, is a trusted adult, someone that they can go to. Recognizing their safety net, some of that safety plowing, and allowing the person to make any decisions you can at this point. Again, is really crucial. Sometimes this may seem trivial, but something really small can be even just, hey, let's sit down and we can like have some space. It's like, do you want to pick out a stuffed animal? That's something I've used in elementary schools, and it has been something that just gives that choice and returns even in that moment some semblance of control for someone can be really helpful. And then asking the person if they have any worries about talking with other people too. This can be really, really important to make sure that you recognize how much further they do or don't want anything shared outside that mandatory report. I'll give that moment to switch over there if you want. All right, next slide, please. And then, so safe supports that hopefully can be provided by mandatory reporters of child abuse are connecting youth with resources and systems that can help them. This may include systems like child welfare, but can also include confidential and more expansive resources. Provide trauma-informed reporting processes. Reporters can each work to create a safe space for people to begin engagement with the expansive systems and structures that help to stop violence and abuse. This includes offering as much control as possible back to the young person whenever possible, and connecting youth to other community resources, including confidential advocacy, which again we're going to talk about in this final session. Because when they know what resources are available in your community, that can provide more in-depth support for the young person and their families, and that can be really meaningful. This includes providing contact information or a warm handoff to these resources to make direct connections. And oftentimes, as I've worked in classrooms in the past, I've been able to work with my local confidential advocates, and they've come into a classroom and helped deliver a session there, and also are able to explain what they do. And then they have that connection to a resource that you can pull on throughout the rest of the year or the rest of your time working with those young people. So there's a lot of ways to potentially collaborate that we'll talk through further. And next slide. And then just wanted to mention here briefly the difference between a report and a disclosure. Disclosure simply refers to telling or discussing one's experiences with violence or abuse with another person. So that can include people with expertise in violence and abuse, like advocates, counselors, or medical providers, or people like family and friends. And sometimes recognizing that when someone is disclosing, oftentimes they just want to get something off their chest. They want to be able to share when they've been kind of pushed into silence in a lot of different ways. So like that can be, and sometimes that disclosure may be accidental where someone doesn't even recognize that they are doing it. So that's kind of the initial, like that's what a disclosure kind of looks like. But then a reporting is oftentimes when someone is a specific type of disclosure, which includes a specific desire to officially record the experience and may come with the expectation that reporting will lead to an investigation and or engagement with accountability processes, which may include the criminal justice system or Title IX processes. And oftentimes when someone wants to make a report, and they may really want to join in and see that change is shifting and happening within after that violence that they experienced. And want to note for mandatory reporters, it is key whether it is a disclosure or someone is wanting to report. Each of those need to be reported, of course. And we want to think about there's so many different systems that especially later on for adults in life, where they have sections where someone can make a disclosure and keep some confidentiality pieces in line in terms where they want to share something, but they still maybe don't want to be identified, as compared to some other reporting where someone wants to further be involved in the process. So again, this can be supported, but we want to ensure that opportunities for safe and resource disclosures, not just reporting, can help mitigate barriers to accessing any services, support empowerment, and can help alleviate potential for re-traumatization too. So just want to name that. All right, and next slide.
All right. So now we're going to talk just very briefly about Title IX and Title IX reports in educational settings. Title IX is going to be applicable when you're in a school-based setting, and we're specifically going to focus on the K through 12 school-based system. If you are not in a school-based setting, this may not necessarily apply, but it can still be helpful to have this information and to know what it looks like in the school setting. So we'll give you just a little bit of background and some information about what this looks like. So Title IX is a federal civil rights law that was passed in 1972. It basically says that you cannot discriminate based on sex in any federally funded education programs, and that includes public K-12 schools as well as public charter schools. That also includes colleges, universities, and some of our other educational programs, including educational programs in incarceration settings, libraries, as anyone who receives federal educational funding. So if you receive any funding, you're required to comply with the provisions of Title IX and to prohibit sex discrimination. So Title IX covers all parts of those programs and activities hosted by education programs. So it applies to things that happen in the classroom, after school programs, field trips, things that happen at school, as well as educational programs that happen away from school. So if you are working in a program that is sponsored by a school district, it's a school district program, even if it happens at a community organization, it's still covered by Title IX. Title IX also protects everyone involved with the school system. So it protects students, employees, as well as third parties participating in the program. So parents or you, if you're a volunteer, anything like that, all people who engage with the school system are protected from sex discrimination. Now, when I'm talking about sex discrimination, you might be wondering why we're talking about that in this specific webinar. But under Title IX, sex discrimination is a wide umbrella term that covers a lot of things, including sexual harassment and sexual assault. And so there can be an overlap between things that might be covered that we need to make a mandatory report about and things that are covered by Title IX. So why is Title IX important? So it requires schools to address all sex discrimination, including sexual harassment and sexual assault. So it has specific requirements that schools have to follow. And really the goal of this is to make sure that schools are addressing any limitations on access to education. So if a student is experiencing sexual harassment or sexual assault and it's getting in the way of their education, they need to be able to report that and get relief from that so that they can continue to access their education and any educational programs. Under Title IX, individuals who experience sex discrimination that impact their school engagement are entitled to specific rights and options for receiving support and addressing concerns. So if you are working with a student and they've experienced sexual harassment or sexual assault in a school-based setting, they have specific rights afforded to them by Title IX. And it's really important that we recognize that they have those rights and refer them to the right people at the school so they can get those rights and options. And as I mentioned, this includes students, employees, and third parties. So anyone who's interacting with the school, like a parent or a volunteer. If you are a public school employee, you're required to report your Title IX concerns. So if you receive a disclosure from a student about possible sex discrimination, including sexual harassment, you have to report it. Um, and or if you just suspect that a student might be experiencing that, if you have a reasonable suspicion, you have to report it to the Title IX coordinator. And whether or not you are a school employee, you might also want to inform students and their families about their Title IX options and rights at school. So again, regardless of which setting you work in, this can be an important thing to keep in the back of your mind and have as a potential resource and option. So one thing I want to note as I'm talking about Title IX right now, Title IX has gone through a lot of changes in the law and how it's interpreted in the past couple of years. There have been some updates in the regulations that tell schools what they have to do or what they're not supposed to do. There was a recent update that went into effect August 1st of this year. And I noted on this slide that it's expected that the new administration that's coming into office, we're recording this webinar on January 15th, so that'll be a week from now that we get the inauguration and have a new presidential administration. It is expected that that new administration will update the regulations and change things. And actually, Eli and I worked on these slides over the past couple months, and on Friday of last week, there was a court case that changed some of the things in this webinar. So I will still be discussing many of the things in this webinar are still true about Title IX, but there are a few updates. And just that's something to keep in mind, that things do change with federal laws and the rights of students. But regardless of the process that changes, Title IX is still in place and still protects students. So under Title IX, there's a really specific definition for sexual harassment. And you'll see on the slide that the term that they use is sex-based harassment. This was a term adopted last year to reflect that it's any harassment on the basis of sex. This term has changed with the court case that came out, so we'll be going back to using the term sexual harassment. And some of these definitions will change slightly, but most of them are still relatively true, as well as the examples that I'll share with you. So these definitions are somewhat legalistic, and it's really not important to understand every single detail of what these definitions mean. What I want you to take away is how to recognize when something might be sexual harassment under Title IX, and therefore the student or employee or volunteer you're working with has specific rights that they can access under Title IX provisions. So let's look at each of these parts of the definition and some examples of what this can look like. And I'll give a content warning again right here that I'm going to share some examples of sexual harassment that has occurred in K-12 schools around Oregon, so you can see what this looks like. But please, again, take care of yourself around hearing those examples. So the first part of the definition is quid pro quo harassment. This is an employee who is conditioning an aid, benefit, or service under the participation in unwelcome sexual conduct. So quid pro quo harassment is basically kind of like an employee, volunteer, an adult who is implying or explicitly stating that someone needs to participate in sexual activity or sexual conduct of any kind to access educational services. So an example of what this could look like. An instructional assistant is helping students complete their homework. When helping one student, they put their arm around the student and rub their shoulder, occasionally grazing the student's breast. The instructional assistant tells the student, "You're lucky I'm helping you. You're such a troublemaker. If you didn't have me, you'd have no one and you'd probably fail this class." So in this example, the instructional assistant is engaging in sexualized content towards the student, and they're implying that there's a threat that, if I don't help you, no one else will, or you might do badly in this class without my assistance. So this would be sexual harassment under Title IX. The second prong is hostile environment harassment. This is a broader definition of unwelcome conduct. It can be physical, it can be verbal, it can be through electronic communications, and it's basically conduct that creates a hostile or unwelcome environment where the student, because of the sexual behavior or conduct, feels like they can't fully participate in school. So an example of what this looks like. At the beginning of the school year, a rumor starts that Kayla got pregnant over the summer and had an abortion. 2 other students make a series of Snapchat stories that highlight all the evidence they have that Kayla was pregnant. The posts call her a slut and list sexual activities they believe Kayla engaged in. The posts are screenshotted and passed around at school, causing Kayla to become upset and distracted during class. So again, this is an example of sexual harassment because we're starting rumors and spreading information about sexual behavior, whether it's true or not, and it's interfering with Kayla's access. The last subcategory is what Title IX calls specific offenses, and this includes sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking. Without going in depth into these definitions, I will say sexual assault generally includes sexual contact without a person's consent. We also see these other behaviors, but I wanted to give you an example of what sexual assault could look like in a school context. On the bus, other boys are teasing Sam for being a virgin. Sam insists he is not a virgin and tells Jaden, and Jaden tells him he has to prove it by showing them that he knows how to use his penis. Other boys gather around and goad Sam and Jaden on while Jaden reaches in Sam's pants, pulls out Sam's penis, and jerks on it. So because this is sexual contact without consent, this would be considered sexual assault under Title IX. So if you are an employee of a K-12 school and you know about any possible sex discrimination, including sexual harassment, you're required to report it to the school's Title IX coordinator so that students can get the information and support they need, and the school can respond to it and investigate it if needed. There's required procedures that the school has to follow, but really one of the most important things is reporting. And just like Eli was talking about, this is required reporting, and so we want to use the same kind of trauma-informed supports, make sure students and their families understand that requirement to report and what kind of support could be available to them. So very briefly, I wanted to go through what happens in Title IX when you report. I'm going to go through this very quickly, but please ask questions if you have them. So the first thing that happens when a Title IX report is made is that the school is required to offer supportive measures. And supportive measures are things that are designed to help the students stay in school and support them emotionally during the Title IX process. So an example might look like providing counseling, providing educational supports, like giving them tutoring or makeup assignments, maybe adding additional adults to supervise a class to prevent things from happening again, separating the students or parties who were involved so that further harassment or assault doesn't occur, all kinds of things. These are just a few examples. The other thing that happens is an IEP or 504 consult. So if any individual who's involved with the Title IX report, either the person who experienced the sexual harassment or the person who committed it, has a disability, the school is required to consult with a member of the student's IEP or Section 504 team to ensure that that student has continued access and they're not violating their rights under those laws. There is a possibility that when there is a report of severe sexual harassment, such as sexual assault, that a student who committed that harassment could be temporarily removed from the K-12 space while the investigation goes on. That tends to be rare in K through 12, but it can happen. And if a student respondent or the person who is accused of committing harassment had a disability, the school would still be required to comply with IDEA and Section 504, or to respect the rights of that student when they were going through that removal process. But that is a place, all of these are places where students might need additional support, and places where you can provide information for them. When there's a Title IX report, usually a Title IX complaint will follow. And then the school engages in an investigatory process to go through and determine what happened, and then potentially to engage in discipline or remedies to help remediate and ensure that things don't happen again. So again, that was a very quick process overview of the Title IX process. And I share all of this because sometimes, again, especially if it's in a school-based setting, there can be a mandatory report that is made, and DHS, law enforcement may be looking into something at the same time as the school is running a Title IX process. So a question I get a lot is, what happens if there is a child abuse investigation or a law enforcement investigation at the same time as a Title IX complaint? So is the school going to be investigating things at the same time? Do they hold off? What happens? So under the Title IX, the law allows the school to put a temporary delay on the Title IX process, which could include for an external investigation, like a DHS or law enforcement investigation. Title IX doesn't allow the school to forego these responsibilities indefinitely, because the goal of Title IX is to ensure continued educational access and to ensure that somebody who experiences sexual harassment doesn't go without access to their education because of that harassment. So schools will still need to put those supportive processes in place, but they may pause, and ideally they will work in conjunction with law enforcement or DHS to allow those agencies to conduct the investigation, and then the school will come in afterwards and continue to support the student throughout the whole process. All right, so that is a very quick overview of Title IX, and now I'm going to turn it back over to Eli to talk about how we can implement these processes collaboratively and in a trauma-informed way.
All right, thank you, Kate. And yeah, recognizing again for a couple questions there, we'll get to that here at the very end and clear up especially a couple pieces, I think, for the mandatory reporting section that I saw there. So I will get to those in just a moment, but want to make sure, yeah, we finish off on this section and think about, again, we're not an island. It's not just us out there. We have resources there, supports further improve how we respond to violence and abuse. So we'll dig into those. If you could go to the next slide, please, Kate. So the first, again, we've talked about mandatory reporters of child abuse. And then next, talked about Title IX reporters. And then finally, we're going to talk about privileged and confidential advocates. So privileged and confidential advocates work through qualifying domestic and sexual violence agencies program throughout Oregon. Just like all the friendship and then dating program support maps I've seen, which is really awesome, just throughout Oregon, there also are qualified domestic and sexual violence advocates working at programs and locally community support programs across our state as well. And we have a resource as well to Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, where they've got all supporting advocates and those community resources. So we can connect you to that here too, to see who your local organization may be. And so these advocates, this may include people from these organizations who provide prevention programming, including prevention education as well in some spaces. Next slide, please. I won't spend as much time on this one here. Again, talking about some of the initial early laws for 1963, establishing mandatory reporting law. But then again, in 1994, the Violence Against Women Act passed. And this mandated any shelter, rape crisis center, domestic violence program, or other victim service program that receives the Victim Violence Against Women Act funding or VPSA funding. I cannot remember the name of that acronym at the moment. They're prohibited from sharing any information about a victim receiving services for that victim and survivors protection as well. And then in 2013, Oregon passed House Bill 4016, expanding who is a mandatory reporter. But again, recognizing that the exception for community-based nonprofit organizations whose primary purpose is to provide confidential, direct services to victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking. And then in 2015, Oregon passes new law 40.264, Rule 507-1, establishing certified advocate victim privilege. And the key difference here between confidentiality and privilege, this is a really quick overview, is that confidentiality is a broader legal protection that applies to confidential information broadly, and privilege is a legal protection that only applies in legal proceedings. So functionally, they both protect confidential information of victims and survivors. So going forward, they're generally here is use confidential advocacy, sometimes privilege. Next slide, please. And so again, with these advocates, we have here this graphic is reporting obligations in the middle. So other types of privileged communications, like lawyers and such, they report abuse to DHS and law enforcement. On the far right, there's mandatory reporters of child abuse. They report abuse to DHS law enforcement. Bottom left, Title IX reporters, they report discrimination or harassment to Title IX coordinator. And then the bottom right, privileged and confidential advocates reports nothing to no one. They are truly driven and supported by the survivor, by the victim, for what they want in the process. And again, this is to be there and ensure that their wishes, their want, their agency, their autonomy is being respected at every step of the way, and that they get to have as much control as possible returned back to them in deciding and advocating for what they want going forward. Next slide, please. And I won't spend too much time with this slide. So visually, so this slide, what we're seeing here, it has got a lot of boxes, a lot of words. At the top, we have confidential options, Title IX required report options, mandatory report. And then under those specific options, there's a ton of different arrows and boxes connecting to kind of paint the visual for how confusing and how complicated these systems can be. Oftentimes, it's overwhelming for me, having done this work for over 10 years, especially then for victims, survivors, families, now having to go through these systems. One thing I will note here on the left-hand side of the screen under confidential options, again, it talks about and like really seeks to show how, regardless throughout any of these systems, that if someone is involved in a mandatory report, they can still have a confidential advocate that supports them throughout navigating these systems and what that may look like, so that they can be there with them each step of the way to support and adding to that information. And also someone too, if someone chooses not to report and that they would like to have start and be confidential, they can stay on the confidential track and not go through that system if they choose not to report that way too, and in conversation with their advocate. And again, advocates do not press someone to report or not report. They will just be there to listen and be centered around what the survivor is wanting in that moment. So, next slide, please. And of course, want to also name quickly that youth rights and access may vary across these already complicated and complex systems. They also see these additional layers of complexities in terms of what that may look like for youth in an education setting, whether that's preschool through high school, college, university, whether that youth is in foster care, in juvenile justice, carceral systems, if they've been victims of crime, what that may look like in faith-based settings and also in medical settings. There are a lot of different laws and that may impact people's rights and confidentiality. And it can be really confusing as well. So a great thing about confidential advocates is that they can be there to support someone regardless of what setting that they're in to help navigate those systems. And also what doesn't show up, and again, coming back within these charts, is we want to be thinking about the way that oppression, including again, ableism, racism, ageism, classism, sexism, xenophobia, and so many more may be impacting the trauma in individual and or family experiences, and the ways the systems, the partners and processes actually either sometimes end up reinforcing some of that oppression for individuals. So which can lead to additional trauma and mistrust of the systems that are actually designed to help, also known as kind of institutional betrayal. So we want someone when they experience harm to get support, but sometimes the systems can make someone feel re-traumatized. And so then in the future, they don't want to end up seeking out supports. Next slide, please. So we want to think about, again, just scope of services that confidential advocates can offer by age. And so this is a chart that has birth to age 4, ages 5 to 11, of course. In those instances, it's not just like, a 5-year-old is walking into a domestic violence agency saying, I want a confidential advocate, right? That oftentimes there's so many nuances and ways that advocates support families when they come seeking shelter. So those are those examples there. I am going to share the age range for 12 to 14 and ages 15 to 18, as it may apply more to the friendship, dating, and relationships program. So ages 12 to 14, when youth are accessing confidential advocates through school, community partnerships, these are usually rooted in prevention education, again, like the friendships and dating programs. So types of support they can offer is advocates can answer questions about dating and sexuality, connecting them with age-appropriate resources and opportunities, assistance around sexual assault protective order applications, and other available legal supports. And then for ages 15 to 18 and up, often when accessed through school or community partnerships, or when a young person has directly reached out to an advocate, additional types of support could include potential access to helping them with shelter and housing, resources and referrals around medical, mental, reproductive health care, connecting them to other legal resources and providers, and support with navigating Title IX and other systems as well. And we'll also note, while advocates can be there in times of disclosure, for a lot of the advocates I've worked with who've worked with youth, oftentimes they say, when youth come and say, I want to disclose something, it may end up being a conversation or a fight that they're currently having, like with a friend sometimes. So sometimes it doesn't rise to anywhere near the level of something that is going to be reportable anyways. It's just been found that sometimes youth have confusion around what may be a report. And so still having a confidential resource ends up being a space where, again, the advocate can support youth in conversations in a way where the youth feels fully controlled and they know that it's going to stay there and they can be in the driver's seat throughout. Next slide, please. So much like with before, the safe supports provided by privileged and confidential advocates. Again, this can include emotional support. This can provide a listening and supportive ear for those who have experienced violence or any form, with no mandatory actions to follow. Confidentiality, working directly with the youth, and they are bound by law to enhance confidence. This includes not sharing information with schools, agency staff, parents or guardians, etc., without a signed, time-limited release of information from survivor or victim. The safety plan, exploring options with youth to enhance safety within their home, school, and community. Inform around minors' rights and making sure that youth understand what their legal rights are as a minor. They can access and help with that access for resources, assisting youth in identifying community and school-based resources that fit their needs, helping to navigate and assisting youth in working through medical processes and community systems, assisting youth in accessing safe shelter and/or transportation, and ultimately empowering and providing unwavering support that encourages youth to make choices that will help improve their situation from their lens and their knowledge of like what is going to be most safe for them. And next slide, please. And just looking at time, Kate, you can skip this slide here. So again, I know that you all will have access to these slides, so that slide will be covered. This one I'll share very briefly. So again, from World Health Organization 2001 found that 2 of the most important factors for teens seeking services are the desire to be treated with respect and the need for confidentiality. And then in the first year, when victim advocate privilege was passed in Oregon, college and university campuses observed a 122% increase in reporting of assault to Title IX officials and a 138% increase in access to on-campus victim services. So, and that was found by the campus program here at the Oregon Attorney General Sexual Assault Task Force. And just really, again, recognizing when people have access to be able to say their truth and be in full control of what they experienced and the steps, which oftentimes can be one of the most important things, is just like, wow, you believed me, you supported me. And without that report happening right away, they have been seeing that oftentimes reports increase because then with time and with support and belief, oftentimes survivors will say, you know what, actually, I do want to report. And so alongside their advocate, they will make that report they want. Next slide, please. Also, connecting youth to confidential advocates lines up with Oregon health education standards. So on the left, we have a standard for 8th grade about identifying community resource and other sources of support, including confidential advocates that students can go to if they have questions about sexual safety or if someone is being sexually harassed, abused, assaulted, or trafficked. And on the right, for high school aged youth, describe how to access resources for survivors of interpersonal violence, sexual violence, and sex trafficking, including local confidential advocacy resources. And these current health education standards, I believe, are going into effect this coming fall. So next year, or this year, fall 2025. And whether or not within the standards of the friendship and dating program, like these standards connect, we again can recognize there's a lot of benefit ultimately in prevention and education for youth being connected to resources that supports their rights and autonomy. Next slide, please. This again is a map of from the OHA, and this is a rape prevention and education resource map. This is also linked in the resources. And this is a map that can show resources across the state of Oregon, and especially identifying sexual and domestic violence community organizations. And then if you click again, Kate, they'll pop up the logo for the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. You can also do further connecting. And again, mentioning within the population for serving people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, there may be lots of additional barriers too, right? At times to make sure that someone is connected to an organization, that they're going to have everything in place to be able to fully support a survivor. So in a couple slides, we have some other resources that really work to have that also have that language and can help advocate in supporting individuals. Next slide, please. And for time's sake, we'll skip this example here so you can go to the next slide. This was just an example of partners in Douglas County, one from the Domestic and Sexual Violence Agency, which was Confidential Advocates, and their local Children's Advocacy Center on the ways that they partnered afterwards, like in terms of whether a report had been made or whether it was confidential advocacy, for recognizing that if you go to the next slide, Kate, again, so many of the benefits to confidentiality for youth, whether that was further helping with comprehensive like supporting and safety planning, rapport building and trust building with a healthy and supportive adult. We know how important that is. Advocates were able to make reports with the student if that was something the youth consented to and wanted to do. and students had the right to a confidential advocate when making reports of sexual assault or sexual violence. So that was often something, and then from that final piece, often from their experience, what they had been seeing is that students wanted support and are generally welcome of supportive services, even if that meant that a report was made. They just wanted to know what steps were being taken and how it was affecting them through the process. So that was an example there in Douglas County of just some of the ways that partnering can help to then lead to more people being connected to resources. Next slide, please. And this is just a graphic across from the initial disclosure when it happened to long-term care and just support going forward with someone's life throughout the process. Next slide. So again, a couple more specific partners and resources to highlight. And I know team at UCED and Morgan, Rihanna, you all will have additional resources and maybe many others on the call as well too. But wanted to highlight Project DART, Disability Awareness and Resource Team, Disability Rights Oregon, Bridges Oregon, and Oregon Self-Advocacy Coalition. In the slides that follow, we have further information from each of these organizations that can really help and support throughout the process for someone getting connected to confidential advocacy, or even if a mandatory report has already been made, connections and supports throughout the process as well. And then next slide, and I think so again, we'll continuing to be thinking about like how can confidential advocacy fit into all of these systems that can identify possible partners and entry points within someone's school district, within Title IX coordinator, and really thinking about all those different ways that someone can fit in, especially if there are other partners or champions specific to if someone is working in the school district. And then about this next slide, if you could advance to one more here, Kate, just really want to end with this one here. So goals for reporting, one of the most important things is just for us as individuals, when we can connect and learn more about confidential advocates and other statewide resources, maybe also within our counties, that gives us more knowledge to be able to share that out with the youth or young people that we're working with, again, in the ways that may be most needed by them to help make sure that that is accessible. And then ensuring that youth and people we serve understand your roles and responsibilities as a mandatory reporter, as well as their rights to confidential resources and options. And a shared goal could be potentially some space in best case when oftentimes as report has been made and a youth may still, or a report may be made connecting and seeing if that youth would like to have an advocate present to talk with ahead of time for that report. And then sometimes that advocate can be present when the report is happening. So just more youth empowerment as is possible, or if that youth has a non-offending or non-harming trusted adult that they want to be there alongside while that report is made. In reality, recognizing that mandatory reports have to be made as soon as possible, oftentimes, not oftentimes as soon as possible. And so it's in some cases where youth may not be able to get to connect to an advocate ahead of that report. You can kind of role play what that can look like with them meeting the advocate later on, do the report, and then still make sure that that youth is connected to that advocate. And final slide. And this is this QR code has resources from this webinar and more to support trauma-informed reporting and collaboration, as well as a guide to some of the pieces in terms of when we are a disclosure has happened and we're making a mandatory report. To really, the question was asked about how do we get more information or to be able to make the report without further pressing or investigating, so to speak. And so there's a whole guide with a list of how to do that, how to ask why questions, open-ended questions, but ultimately just as much information as youth want to share and being supportive of them, but just making sure that we're not pressing them for details. When we call the hotline, we don't have to have a solid, like a full case that says this is why this is abuse or neglect or violence. Like that is something the hotline and law enforcement will be determining. So it's just, again, not pressing youth for details. But so that resource is also going to be at that QR code, and I can get a hyperlink as well to pass to the team here at UCED for after the training. Next slide is just some of the citations. And then the final slide here is emails for Kate and myself. Again, I know that there's so much to this conversations. Time has gone very fast, but these are our emails, and we welcome any further conversations and want to be able to support in any way that is helpful going forward. So these emails are there. And we'll pass it back over to Morgan and Rihanna, unless Kate, you want to add in anything here too. And I see that we are right at time.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for your attention and questions today. And hopefully this has been helpful, and look forward to connecting with you all more in the future.
Thank you. And then Rihanna's going to drop like our email addresses in the chat, as well as a survey to take. We did have 3 questions that we didn't have time for. And so Eli and Kate, if you can see those questions, if we want to like respond to those on the follow-up material, that might be helpful. We can just save those questions.
Yes, yeah, definitely can respond back to those and have that information there.
Yeah, I also think some of those questions would be great to ask in the second webinar, because I think some of the folks who are presenting there might be able to even better answer those than myself and Eli.
That's a good point. Yes, we can save those and ask them in the webinar that will be next week. All right. Thank you, everyone. And don't forget to fill out the survey. And we hope to see you next week if you're interested in our second webinar.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for the roles you play.